Hello guys, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm gonna talk about a senior opposition figure. His name is Majdi Name, or better known as Islam Allouche. He called himself Islam Allouche since he was the spokesperson of an armed terrorist group called Jaish al-Islam, which started its military operation against the Syrian government since the early days of the so-called revolution in Syria, and it's still operating in Syria. However, before 2018, the main headquarters of Jaish al-Islam was in eastern Ghouta on the suburbs of Damascus. But later, when the Syrian army and the Russian Air Force conducted a joint offensive against the group, they were forced to leave into northern Syria. This group was mainly supported, funded, and armed by Saudi Arabia. And the ideology of the group is Wahhabism, which means they believe in the creation of a caliphate, and they despise and consider democracy as a form of a sin, or it's against the rule of God, according to their interpretation of the religion. And this group has caused a lot of damage to both the Syrian government and the civilians in Damascus during this era. And it was allied with different groups in eastern Ghouta, including the so-called Free Syrian Army, and they have committed horrendous crimes during the past years, and these are all documented by even the Western mainstream media, who were forced to confess or admit the fact that this group is a very radical group, despite the fact that some of the Western governments were calling them moderate rebels during the previous era. This group, for example, used all sorts of terroristic techniques that you can't even imagine. For example, they used to kidnap civilians, especially those who are from or with the Syrian government, and religious minorities, and they used to cage them, put them in cages, and then bring these cages over on the top of buildings in order to use them as human shields during the military operation against the Syrian army. They invaded a few towns in the suburbs of Damascus, and they kidnapped children and women. They burned people alive in ovens, in bakery ovens. There is one example that was documented by Western mainstream media, that when this Jaish al-Islam was invading the houses of the civilians, one of the men or fathers, he was expecting this invasion because it was everywhere on the news. So he had a hand grenade in his hand, and when the terrorists broke into this in his house, he was with his wife and underage children. So instead of giving himself and his family to this terrorist, surrendering to this terrorist, he used the hand grenade and he exploded himself and his family, and he killed the terrorist as well. So this group has kidnapped hundreds of Syrian civilians, and they use them as forced labor, slavery, in order to dig tunnels in Douma, which could reach to many other towns and cities in the suburbs of Damascus. So they were basically a very famous terrorist group in Syria, and this Islam Allouche, or his real name is Majdi Name, was the spokesperson of this group, he was giving excuses or trying to promote this group to the Syrian people at the first hand, and to the Western audience by trying to manipulate the audience and try to portray themselves as a moderate group, despite the fact that the leader or the former leader of Jaish al-Islam, his name is Zahran Allouche, he called publicly for the extermination of the religious minorities. He called for complete genocide of religious minorities in Syria in order to create an Islamic caliphate, quote unquote. Zahran Allouche was later killed by a joint Russian-Syrian airstrike on one of the headquarters of Jaish al-Islam on the eve of Christmas in 2015. Later, he was succeeded with Muhammad Allouche. He is the brother of Zahran Allouche. And during this time, this Islam Allouche, or Majdi Name, was still the spokesperson of the Jaish al-Islam. He stayed in his position till 2016. And in 2016, he gave an interview to an Israeli news outlet, and because of that interview, he also spoke about how the Jaish al-Islam is ready to make peace with Israel. So he embarrassed, or he put his group under pressure, because they claim to be also anti-Israel, but at the same time, they're the ones who invaded first the defensive defense air bases of the Syrian army, and they destroyed a lot of air defense systems of the Syrian army during the early days of the so-called Syrian revolution. So he had to leave his job in 2016 because of this interview, not because he disagrees with the group, and he fled to Turkey. He stayed in Turkey, and obviously he enrolled in one of the universities there, and later in 2019, he fled to Europe. And some people think that he fled with the refugees, like he just took a boat, traveled to Greece, and then from Greece walked to Western Europe or to France, to be particular. But no, this guy has been granted an Erasmus. He was granted an educational visa from the French embassy in Ankara, and he was enrolled in an Erasmus program in France, and to be exact, I believe in Marseille. So he arrived in France as a student, a guy who was the spokesperson of a terrorist group in Syria, which the minimum or the least or like the mini crime that this group commits is beheading. This is the least thing that they used to do. This guy has been granted an Erasmus visa. I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I know people in Syria, and they're my friends. They are applying for student visas in the last years, whether in Germany, whether in France, whether in other European countries. And they are studying hard, and they are doing, like, let's say, German courses or French courses in order to study in these countries. And their visa applications have been refused. And this guy has been granted a student visa to France. So he arrived in France in 2019, and he started studying. And I checked his LinkedIn account. It's so funny that he's calling himself an expert in, he calls himself an expert in security, intelligence, and anti-terrorism, or counter-terrorism. So the guy who was the spokesperson of an infamous terrorist group in Syria is calling himself an expert in counter-terrorism. So he got his visa, he arrived in France, he started studying, and obviously some of the opposition groups, because these opposition groups are also in conflict with each other. So some of them were unhappy that Islam Allouche has arrived in France, and he or she told the French security or the French special competent authorities that this guy is a criminal, and he committed war crimes, and he was kidnapping people, etc., etc. So the French authorities detained the guy on charges of committing war crimes, kidnapping, torture, and forced disappearance. And he was arrested in January 2020, and today we are March 2021, and a recent photo has been leaked to the media and been published by opposition activists and journalists, and it shows clearly that he has been beaten by or tortured by the French security apparatuses. Now, a little bit like, if I'm gonna give some context to this issue, I want to raise some questions. Why is Europe accepting prominent terrorist figures in Europe to begin with? And when I spoke about, and I said there are radicals coming to Europe and infiltrating the ranks of the refugees, the real refugees, I was attacked, smeared, and attempts of character assassination has been conducted by especially German mainstream media and followed by other Western mainstream media and then Turkish and Qatari-backed media outlets. Because I said there are radicals among the newcomers in Europe, and now we can see clearly that even the European governments are no more able to protect their assets. So when I say their assets, these guys are geopolitical tools being used by certain Western governments, especially the UK, France, the United States, and other regional countries such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey. And when Saudi Arabia stopped funding this group, they were dissolved and they forced to live into northern Syria, and Turkey embraced them and now is supporting them. And these guys robbed millions of dollars. They went to Turkey later and they started their own businesses there as if nothing happened in Syria. But the question is always, why is Europe embracing these people? Like you dislike the Syrian regime, quote unquote, and you consider this regime as an authoritarian and dictatorship. Then why you are supporting groups in Syria that are not only undemocratic, but also brutal? They are terroristic groups. They are groups who won't hesitate to kill Europeans and Western people because they were born on a different religion. Of course, these people in Syria, they have killed hundreds of thousands of people, and comparing to Europe, maybe the European or Western officials, maybe they consider if one of these people commit a terrorist attack in Syria, this could be like a collateral damage for them. I don't know. But the fact is, since, for example, the 80s, when the so-called Muslim Brotherhood, this terrorist organization in Syria, has declared a revolution, armed uprising against the Syrian government, their headquarters of this group, either media figures, journalists, they were in Europe, they were in the UK, they were in Brussels, they were in Germany. And the same applies to the so-called Syrian revolution today. I mean, if Western governments support, let's say, democratic groups in Syria in order to pave the way for a better life in Syria, this could be understandable from their point of view, not from the Syrian point of view, because in either way it's an interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. But at least when you want to claim that you're supporting a democratic revolution, but you're supporting radical Islamist groups who despise democracy, then this is not only double standard, this triple standard. I don't know what to call it. And just compare the media coverage of the arrest of Islam Allouche to the coverage of similar or same media outlets of me. They demonized me, they called me all sorts of names, they tried to conduct a character assassination, they tried to mobilize the radicals in Germany against me, and I've been attacked many times in the streets just because I said, guys, there are radicals in Europe. Just let's filter them so that the majority of the refugees who are not posing security danger to Germany or in other countries can live in peace and they can integrate faster. And that Germans would not, for example, perceive or say that Syrian refugees are bad, or I don't know what kind of, for example, they say Syrian refugees are refugees. Why do they say that? Because 1 or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or maybe 20 or maybe 100 of, let's say, 1 million Syrian refugees have committed sexual crimes in Germany, and then all of them have been called refugees. So when we filter at least these radicals, the criminals, we pave the way for the good refugees to integrate, to learn the language, to study, to work, to do whatever they want. What's wrong in this narrative? What's wrong in this argument? Do you consider this a radical right-wing or a fascist argument? I don't know how people think about it. I don't know how they can interpret this as some sort of a right-wing narrative. People like Islam Allouche have committed horrendous war crimes in Syria. And don't get me wrong, if there is someone from the Syrian government side, let's say, who fled to Germany as a refugee and he has a history of any sort of crimes in Syria, I'm for persecuting these people as well. Anyone who committed crimes in Syria, whether with or against the government, I'm for persecution of these people. Because I believe in a state of law. I believe in a government, a functioning government that respects laws. But these guys, they don't believe in even in constitution. They're saying we want Islamic Caliphate, and Islamic Caliphate means no constitution. They don't believe in civil constitution. They don't believe in civil codes. They don't believe in civil society. So why Western governments supporting these groups? They're using them against the Middle Eastern people. They are keeping us centuries behind. They're destroying the social fabric. They're forcing the people to leave their countries after years of wars and devastation. And they're creating refugee crisis. If you want to stop the refugee crisis, then stop the wars. Stop bombing people. Stop destroying their homes. And don't say that this was some sort of a revolution in Syria. You created this war in Syria. You launched a regime change war on Syria because you dislike the Syrian government and think that it's giving access to its strategic allies such as Iran and Russia. So you wanted to destroy it. And now you're starving these people. You're imposing draconian sanctions on Syria and you call it targeted sanctions. It's so fucking unbelievable. How is it possible that this is a targeted sanctions while at the same time you are banning transactions? Like, if I am a person who wants to import medicine to Syria and I can't make a transaction, how this is called the targeted sanctions? If Syrians, ordinary Syrians, are not able, for example, to open bank accounts, to have a PayPal account, how is this possible to be called a targeted sanctions? I will tell you one example. Some of my followers sometimes send me donations on PayPal, and they write in the note, "Thank you for everything you do for Syria." And these transactions by them is being blocked by PayPal because of just writing Syria in this note. Targeted sanctions. And now Joe Biden is escalating the situation in Syria, and he recently bombed a position in Syria in retaliation to an attack that maybe happened in Iraq. And I mean, Mark Twain once said, God created wars so that Americans learn geography, but it seems even this is not really applicable nowadays, because I'm seeing people on Twitter, for example, are defending Joe Biden's bombing of Syria as an act of self-defense. How is it possible that this is an act of defense while you, as an United States forces, are illegally occupying Iraq and illegally occupying Syria? How is this called a self-defense? Self-defense means that you're defending yourself in the United States, not in Syria or in Iraq. Guys, common sense, please. It's really driving me crazy, and these so-called progressives in the United States, none of them condemned Joe Biden for bombing, illegally bombing. It's unconstitutional and it's illegal. It's really crazy. I don't know what else to say. If you know why Western governments are supporting these guys, who are not only our enemies in Syria, but also your enemies in Europe and in the United States, please let me know in the comments below. And if you're new and you like the content of my channel, please subscribe. It really helps me a lot. And leave a comment. Let me know why Western governments are supporting this group. And see you in the next video. And my dog has just came at his See you next time.